Hey guys, and welcome back. First of all, I do want to say thank you so much for all your support on my last video. It was the first true crime video that I had uploaded in 5 months, and so many of you guys turned up to just say beautiful comments saying that you were happy that I was back. I honestly thought maybe nobody would be there when I uploaded, but so many of you turned out to show your love and support, and for that, I cannot express how grateful I am. Like, over the years, I have had many a break on YouTube. You guys know I've been through some ups and downs. I work full time, so I'm sort of here sometimes and sometimes I'm not, but you guys support me through it all, and truly, I cannot tell you how much gratitude I have for being in the position where I just have people that will continue to support me no matter how many breaks I need to take. And there's so many of you in the comments that I recognize, and I'm truly, like, I'm happy and I'm grateful, and I love YouTube. I love you guys. Thank you again. But today we are doing another solved true crime case. This time we are heading to Victoria, to the small regional town of Shepparton. And this case is about 30 years old. And actually, up until recently, it was one of Australia's longest running cold cases. And this case really is a prime example of one person in the community holding the key to solving a case, but there just needing to be a push from, the public, journalists, the media, to get that person to speak up. And it really is just the passage of time sometimes that will give that person the confidence to finally speak up and tell the police what they know. I think we always talk about in cases like this, long-running cold cases, that somebody knows something. It's just a matter of finding that person. And this case is an example of this. And this case is also kind of cool because it was actually one single journalist that really pushed to have this case reopened, pushed this case back into the spotlight, and ultimately it was really because of her that this case was solved. That's why I kind of found this case really great, because sometimes it does just take one person to solve a case. But anyway, that's enough for today's intro. Let's get into the case of 16-year-old Michelle Buckingham. So heading back to October of 1983, as I said, to the small regional city of Shepparton in Victoria, which has a population as of 2020 of about 67,000 people. So it is quite a small city or town. And there lived teenager Michelle, and Michelle was this bright, bubbly, beautiful teenager. She was really tall and she had a stylish blonde bob, so she was really a girl that stood out in a crowd. And she was very well liked as well at her high school, Shepparton High School, but she wasn't the biggest fan of high school, which neither was I. I went to school to socialize, and that's about it. So I totally get it. And Michelle's teachers actually say that she kind of was a bit of a distraction at school. She didn't really want to be there to do the schoolwork. She was just there to sort of, have a chat, see people, socialize, distract, and I totally get it. Michelle really did want to leave school and gain some independence, start working, start making money, and that's exactly what she did. After year 10, she left school and gained employment so she could become a more independent person. And side note, I did the same thing actually. I left school after year 10. I was sick of it and got a job, and actually the job sucked. So I went back to school the following year, but anyway, Michelle left, got a job, and she was really, by the sounds of it, loving her life of independence. And the next thing she was planning to do was move out of her mother Elvira's house. But this idea, I guess, was fast-tracked one day after a minor argument with her mum led her to abruptly leave. And her mother did discourage the idea of her leaving. Elvira did not want Michelle to leave, but Michelle was a very strong-willed girl, and when she said she was going to do something, it sounds like she was going to do it. So she left, and really this minor tiff with her mum was the push she needed to get up and leave home and start a new life living independently. So Michelle moved into the local caravan park, the Stray Leaves Caravan Park, but she did actually have a rental lined up for the coming week, so this was a very temporary situation. So the argument with her mum had been on October 19, and the following day, October 20, Michelle was actually spotted out with friends at a concert for Rose Tattoo at the Goulburn Valley Hotel, and she was seen dancing with friends and having a good time, so it did appear that this situation with her mum didn't particularly bother her. As I said, it had been quite a minor tiff, but it did give her that push to gain a little bit more independence in her life, despite the fact her mum wasn't really on board with this idea. The next day on the Friday, October 21, Michelle had a shift at her job at Coles Supermarket. Her shift was from 10 a.m. until 9 p.m. But at around 6:30 p.m, she tells her colleagues that she isn't really feeling too well and she decides to head home. On her walk home, she stops by the Victoria Hotel where she runs into her friend Lee Wilson. Michelle tells Lee that her plans for that night are just to head back to the caravan park, have a shower, freshen up, and then head back to her mum's to pick up some of her belongings. And Lee does notice that Michelle is not her usual bright and bubbly self, but he doesn't really think too much of it. After all, she did leave work not feeling too well, so maybe she was a bit stressed or run down, or who really knows, but it did appear that she was feeling a little bit not herself that evening. After a quick chat with Lee, Michelle leaves the Victoria Hotel and begins the pretty quick walk back to the Stray Leaves Caravan Park, passing the Star Bowl bowling alley where she actually runs into a couple of more friends. Michelle and her friends have a brief conversation, and during this brief conversation with her friends, she asks them what the best way back to the Stray Leaves Caravan Park is on foot, and they say to her to walk along the main street under the streetlights. After this short conversation, Michelle farewells her friends and, dressed in a Mickey Mouse jumper and jeans, she begins her walk back to the caravan park, which is about 3 kilometres or 1.8 miles. But Michelle would never make it back to the caravan park. The next day, Michelle doesn't turn up for a shift at Coles, and despite this being very out of character for Michelle, for her to simply not show up for a shift, alarm bells don't seem to ring for anybody. Her parents are informed, but there seems to be this miscommunication or mix-up over the following week where her mum Elvira believes that Michelle's staying with her father, and her father Jeff believes that Michelle's staying with her mother. Her parents are divorced, by the way, and her friends all believe that she is staying with somebody else. Thus, nobody actually realises that Michelle is missing. And it's not until the 28th of October that she's officially reported missing by her parents, and it's at this point that police put out a plea to the public for any information on the missing 16-year-old, who they don't believe is a runaway. And she actually went missing on the 21st, so from the 21st to the 28th, nobody's heard anything from Michelle. Nobody's seen her, she hasn't turned up to any of her shifts. So it's extremely concerning for police, for her friends, for her family, for the whole small community of Shepparton, wondering where this girl has gone. I'm also guessing that in a small city like Shepparton, people don't disappear very often, let alone young teenage girls, so it's probably quite shocking for the community. I hadn't actually heard of Shepparton before this video, as seems to be the case with me and any video I cover about a small city or town in Australia. So my geography is really improving making these videos. But if you're from Shepparton or near Shepparton, let me know below. I'd love to hear from you. So now we're fast forwarding to Monday, November 7, when a farmer is driving down a Violet Town Road in the small town of Kyla East, located just outside of Shepparton. He's driving past some long grass when something in the grass catches his attention. He can't quite tell what it is as he drives past. It just appears to be this meter high pile or lump laying there. So curiosity getting the better of him, he pulls over his vehicle to see what he has spotted. And what this farmer would see would stick with him for the rest of his life. A body in a severely decomposed state, wearing jeans and a Mickey Mouse jumper, is lying in a roadside drain. The police, of course, are immediately contacted, and the remains are soon identified as those of 16-year-old Michelle Buckingham. And upon examination, it is found she was stabbed 19 times in the back. And although her killer or killers didn't particularly make a big effort to conceal her body, although she was in a more rural area, because she had been out in the elements for quite a couple of weeks or quite a few weeks, and the state of her decomposition was quite severe, any vital evidence was unfortunately destroyed. Not to mention that forensics back in 1983 weren't exactly where they are today. But having said that, had a few more weeks passed, or if this farmer had not become curious, Michelle may never have been found. So after speaking with witnesses, friends and family, it was established that Michelle was either abducted or accepted a lift in between the Star Bowl bowling alley and the caravan park. After all, she was asking for directions. The walk was not long, but it was, still 3 kilometers. So if somebody that she kind of knew offered her a lift, she potentially took it. And let's not forget, it's a small town. I feel like maybe back in 1983, there was more of a, what's the word? I can't think of the word, but just like more of an acceptance of trusting people and trusting your people in your local community, or people that may kind of be strangers, but not really, because, it is such a small town. So everyone knows each other. Everyone trusts each other, even if it's just like, oh, that's my friend's brother's cousin. So I know them. So I trust them. I'll accept this lift. Anyway, the only problem is that police didn't have any witnesses to an abduction or Michelle accepting a lift. Nobody heard a scream. Nobody saw a scuffle. Nobody saw anything. So at this stage, they had nothing to go off. And then there was the question of who would kill Michelle? Who would hurt Michelle with such anger to be stabbed 19 times in the back? That is incredibly intense. And in her mother's words, she was kind, she was caring, and she was well liked. She didn't have any major enemies or ex-boyfriends that, she didn't get along with. Although Michelle had had some boyfriends in the past, none of them had been serious. And as I said, at school, she was popular and sociable, and, she liked to attend school for the social aspect. So police really couldn't think of anybody that would want to hurt Michelle. And so police were struggling to find any kind of suspect, let alone a prime suspect. And the other problem was that they couldn't find the murder weapon, which was a knife. The only real valuable information that the police had so far in this investigation was a witness sighting of a car parked near where Michelle's body was found. And in fact, this car was seen parked there twice on the same day, not long after Michelle is assumed to have been killed, which is the day she disappeared. And this car was a green 1973 HQ Holden sedan. And let's not forget that where Michelle's body was found was on a rural road. So what reason would any vehicle have to park on this road twice in the same day, right near where Michelle's body was found? So it was assumed that the killer owned this car. That's the only thing that really makes sense at this point. But unfortunately, this witness sighting of the vehicle wasn't enough to even lead to a suspect. So a couple of months later, something very bizarre happens. A local criminal lawyer named Brian Birrell is sitting at his desk in his office when a man walks in, throws down a knife on his desk and says, "This is the knife that was used to kill Michelle Buckingham. And I know it was the knife used to kill Michelle because I was a witness to the murder." I don't even know what you would do if that happened. You're just a criminal lawyer sitting at your desk and someone throws a knife down in front of you, telling you that's the murder weapon. First of all, Brian Birrell was very, very careful not to touch this potentially very, very valuable piece of evidence. But second of all, he asked the man, whose name was Peter Gledhill, exactly what happened. Because if he knew who killed Michelle, he was going to need to know the full details of the events and who did it and how he managed to be the person in possession of the knife. So Peter Gledhill, whose nickname was actually Punchy, nicknamed by locals because of how often he managed to get into fights and punch-ups. kind of strange, but okay. He proceeds to tell this criminal lawyer that he was forced to watch Michelle be stabbed to death. And Brian Birrell would later describe how Gledhill made these sounds, these stabbing sounds like a knife stabbing into flesh. And he later said that these were sounds that he could never get out of his head. It was just a very disturbing, I don't know, a very disturbing sound. I don't think that was the sound. I don't know why I made that sound. But he would later just say that, as I said, Gledhill made this impression of a knife going into flesh, and he was just so disturbed by this. But of course, Brian Birrell said to Gledhill, we're going to need to take this to the police. So that's exactly what he did. And Gledhill, who was 26, told the police that himself and 3 other men were driving down the main street of Shepparton when they spotted Michelle leaving the Victoria Hotel. The 3 men, all of which Gledhill names to the police, decide that they're going to abduct Michelle, drug her, take her to a house, rape her, and then kill her. And Gledhill is actually able to take police to this house. And of course, the police, look around the house and actually use luminol to try and find any evidence of blood, because if Michelle was murdered here, if she was stabbed 19 times, surely there is going to be evidence of blood everywhere. But they find nothing. And the time and location in which Gledhill even says that Michelle was abducted doesn't line up with other witness statements from that night. Gledhill says they abducted Michelle around 8:30 p.m, just after she left the Victoria Hotel, where other witnesses say they saw her walking along the main street past the bowling alley. She talked to her friends outside the bowling alley. So his story isn't exactly making any sense or lining up. Like this house had no evidence, the time's not making sense, but why would somebody go to a criminal lawyer and then make a statement to the police and bring a knife to the police and to this lawyer if he had no involvement? And of course, by the way, these 3 men were brought into the police and interviewed, but it was found that they really didn't have anything to do with Michelle's murder. So as you can imagine, police begin to believe that Peter Gledhill is the killer. And this whole story was just a ruse or a distraction to take them away from the actual story of what happened to Michelle. And to add to this, when they took Gledhill to the scene of the crime where Michelle's body was found, he started acting very strangely. And to add to that, police later found out that Gledhill kind of knew who Michelle was. They weren't friends and they were barely even acquaintances, but the two had been at several parties together, and apparently Gledhill had formed quite an obsession with Michelle. So Gledhill was eventually arrested and charged with the murder of Michelle Buckingham. This charge is very quickly dismissed at the committal though, due to a lack of evidence. But the police do still believe that he is guilty, and the public believe he is guilty as well. And quite frankly, he is treated like a guilty person by the public. He continues to be beat up more than he apparently was before, hence the nickname Punchy. He becomes a bit of a recluse. He moves back in with his parents. He never works again. He really ends up leading a sad, sad life. But as the years go on, the police don't find any more evidence to point to Peter Gledhill, and he does remain a free man, although, as I said, a very, a sad man, a recluse, a hermit, and the public really do believe that he is the guilty one. He's the one that killed Michelle. But I'm just going to jump ahead in the timeline for a moment because you guys know this is a solved case. It would turn out that Gledhill was innocent. But again, that does beg the question, why did he involve himself in a murder investigation? There are a couple of theories on this. One was that he was trying to get in with a local bikie gang. Another is that he suffered from mental health issues. But realistically, nobody really knows why he did what he did. And I guess even if he did it for the wrong reasons, his life was ruined on account of this mistake that he made, which is actually quite sad. And not to mention the fact his name would not be cleared for 30 years. And living in a small town, And people thinking that you're guilty for 30 years cannot be easy. Not that he didn't put himself in that situation, but if he was suffering from mental health issues, then yeah, it's very sad. So this brings me all the way forward to 2012, when a local Shepparton journalist named Tammy Mills was working on a series of stories on local cold cases, when one in particular caught her attention, and that was, of course, the case of Michelle Buckingham. So Michelle's case really hadn't received much attention since the 1980s, since it happened. And Tammy, who worked for the Shepparton News, really thought that by highlighting Michelle's story, there was a strong possibility that somebody in the community would know something or have that one key piece of information that could solve this case, which to her seemed like a relatively solvable case. So Tammy begins by speaking to Michelle's mother, Elvira, who not only still lives in Shepparton, but she still lives in the same home that herself and Michelle did. And she also actually left Michelle's bedroom pretty much as it was when Michelle disappeared 30 odd years previous, which is somewhat sad, but Tammy does describe this house as somewhat having a presence of Michelle in it, which does make sense because her mum, I'm sure, would have, kept all her stuff there and her photos there and not changed too much because of what happened and the fact she never got that closure. And I think when you don't get closure in a case like that, how can you move on? How can you pack away their things or move house or, move cities when things are left unfinished? So Elvira, although she is somewhat wary because she has been disappointed in the past with people believing they can solve this case, but she does give Tammy her blessing to do the story in the newspaper, in the Shepparton News. Next, Tammy contacts Detective Ron Iddles, who is known as the Great Man or Australia's greatest detective due to his high conviction rate, and we have actually spoken about him in the past. But Ron Iddles does unfortunately tell Tammy that he just does not have the time or resources right now to help with Michelle Buckingham's case. Tammy is quite persistent, however, and Ron does eventually relent and tell Tammy, look, I'm flying to Shepparton to see you. He was Melbourne-based. I'm coming to Shepparton to see you and discuss the matter. I believe this is a solvable case as well. So Ron heads to Shepparton. Tammy and Ron discuss their thoughts on the case. And as I said before, he believes that there's one person in the community that very likely holds the key to blowing this case wide open. And quite frankly, from what I can tell, this was the only chance of solving Michelle's case, is finding a witness in the community or somebody that has information, because as far as any evidence that the police have on Michelle's case, there's nothing. Nothing has really been preserved. All they have kept is 11 crime scene photos and an autopsy report. And none of that has been helpful in solving her case thus far. So as Tammy gets to work on the story, Ron Iddles reopens Michelle's case and agrees to take on any new potential leads that may come through. And like Tammy did, Ron Iddles visits Elvira and tells her that her daughter's case has been officially reopened. And again, Elvira is kind of dubious about the whole situation, but gives Ron her blessing. And it's also worth noting that this was actually Tammy's first job in journalism, making her persistence on the case even more impressive. In August of that year, Tammy publishes the first of what will be a 5-part series on the Michelle Buckingham case with the eye-catching headline, "Who Killed Michelle?" And it also had a photo of Michelle in a black and white striped jumper. And it was this headline, "Who Killed Michelle?", that actually caught the attention of a man that actually happened to rap the local newspapers, Norman Gribble. Upon seeing this renewed interest in the case, Norman reached out to his brother Lawrence to discuss what they knew about the murder. And between the two of them, they both agreed that it was about time that her mother, Michelle's mother Elvira, found out the truth about what happened to her daughter. So it was actually Lawrence that contacted the police to let them know what him and his brother had known for a very long time. So the police passed this information on to Ron Iddles, and then Ron Iddles contacted Norman Gribble. So basically Norman said to Ron, I have information on who killed Michelle. I know who killed Michelle, but I want my statement off the record. So Ron agreed to meet up with Norman at a local football oval late one night, which, I mean, I guess in hindsight probably wasn't the safest idea or the best idea, but, you know, he was a detective, a tough guy. I'm sure he knew what he was doing. So at around 7 p.m. one evening, Norman Gribble and Ron Iddles met at a local football oval where Norman proceeded to tell Ron the following story. On the morning of October 22nd, 1983, his brother-in-law, whom he was very close to at the time, Stephen Bradley, who was then 21 years old, approached him in a state of distress with bloodied cuts all over his hands, telling Norman, I killed someone last night. We killed someone last night. He continued telling Norman that himself and his two mates, Rodney Butler and Trevor Corrigan, both 16 years old at the time, had gone to the Stray Leaves caravan park the previous evening in his green HQ Holden sedan to pick up his then girlfriend when they spotted Michelle Buckingham, whom Rodney had actually dated briefly several years earlier. And if you remember, I did mention a green HQ Holden that was spotted near the crime scene twice right after Michelle was killed. Unfortunately, this car was sold pretty shortly after the murder, and although the investigation did attempt to track it down, they never could find it. But at least they did have this evidence that the person that Norman Gribble was saying was the killer owned this green HQ Holden vehicle. So anyway, Norman continues telling Ron that his brother-in-law, Stephen Bradley, says that on the night that Michelle was walking back to the Stray Leaves caravan park, they spotted her, offered her a lift, and she accepted it. And once she was inside the vehicle, all three men were pressuring her to have sex with them, which she refused. And this was when they decided that she needed to be killed. She needed to die because she had refused sex with them. And Stephen Bradley would claim to his brother-in-law, Norman Gribble, that they decided to do this so she couldn't dob them in, which is beyond pathetic. But Steve Bradley would later say to his brother-in-law that he had just witnessed the 19 times that Michelle was stabbed. He didn't actually partake. He said he pretended to partake, but he actually did not stab Michelle. And it was in the parking lot behind the Pine Lodge Hotel in Stephen Bradley's car where Michelle was stabbed violently 19 times for no reason whatsoever before being dumped on the roadside at Kyella East, where she would remain for the next several weeks. Norman Gribble told Ron about how his brother-in-law Stephen crawled into a fetal position and was very upset and traumatized and crying, telling him this story about how Michelle was killed. And Norman insisted that he go to the police with this story if he had not partaken in the murder, but he refused, and he said it was best that, he basically forget this whole thing ever happened and just leave Shepparton forever. And he did just that. Pretty much straight away, he up and left Shepparton forever. So why exactly did Norman Gribble hold on to this terrible, I'm sure, very heavy, very terrible secret for so long? I'm sure it would have somewhat filled him with a lot of guilt, knowing that he knew that Michelle's family had been suffering for 3 decades. And he did tell Ron the reason, and I think I don't want to say it's a reasonable reason, but I understand. Basically, he didn't want to tear his family apart. So Stephen Bradley was his wife's brother, so his brother-in-law. And I mean, she's like, he said that, his family was very close at this time. So imagine knowing that your wife's brother was a murderer, but all of your family were so close. Maybe your wife is incredibly close to her brother. How do you tell her that? I'm not even sure what I would do in that situation. I guess you could put in an anonymous tip, but maybe being disloyal to your family would be even more of a burden to you personally. And I think we all know how intense family loyalty can be. So I don't want to judge him for not coming forward earlier, but at the same time, he held the key to solving this case for 30 years and he didn't do anything. He did tell his brother, Lawrence, eventually. I think he only told Lawrence a couple of years before he was here telling Ron, but basically he said that the reason he decided to come forward now, after of course seeing the article by Tammy, was because his family wasn't that close and he didn't really feel like he'd be cutting any family ties by coming forward and telling the truth. And that's why I guess police say sometimes the passage of time allows people to come forward and confess what they know, because those loyalties aren't always there after many decades. So Norman Gribble did eventually agree to give his statement on the record, and his statement did line up with evidence that police already had. Police did believe his version of events, and this eventually did lead to the arrest of now Brisbane-based dog groomer Stephen Bradley. So during his initial interview, Stephen Bradley, who is now in his early 50s, does not confess to the murder of Michelle Buckingham. But as he is interviewed several more times, his story begins to change, and quite frankly, his interviews are rather bizarre, especially as they progress. At first, he says that he doesn't even know who Michelle is and never knew her and doesn't know anything about the case, which is basically impossible if you lived in Shepparton in the early 80s. He then says that, okay, he does know who Michelle Buckingham is, but he doesn't know who killed her. And then he says that he's not sure if he killed Michelle or not. Finally, he admits that he was present for the murder of Michelle, but he did not partake in the murder. But he did confess to partaking in the disposal of her body. He does also admit to owning a green HQ Holden sedan back in the early 80s. Bradley also names his former friends, Rodney Butler and Trevor Corrigan, as the two men who killed Michelle, but when they're spoken to, they deny any involvement in her murder. And unfortunately, due to lack of physical evidence, their involvement can't be proven one way or another, so police are forced to let them go. Another very bizarre element of Bradley's interviews is, and by the way, some of these were conducted by Ron Iddles, is when he talks about being haunted by a young blonde girl. He says that he would often see the ghost of this girl sitting on the end of his bed and sometimes sitting on his chest and trying to suffocate him. He also spoke of carrying knives in his dreams and stabbing something and disposing of bodies, and it's almost as though his dreams have become confused with his reality. But in the end, Stephen Bradley and Stephen Bradley alone is charged with the murder of Michelle Buckingham. Tragically, just 2 weeks before the murder trial commences, Michelle's mother, Elvira, dies of an undiagnosed heart condition, just 68 years old and barely missing the chance to see her daughter's killer brought to justice, which is so incredibly sad. Waiting this long to finally see a conclusion, to see justice, to finally gain some peace in her life, and she misses it by this much. Just horrible. And Michelle's father is also not with the family. He had died back in the late 1980s. But her siblings, older sister Karen and younger brother Philip, are both there to witness the trial, as well as extended family. At the trial, Stephen Bradley pleads not guilty to the murder, but guilty to the disposal of the body. And the two other men that Bradley named, Butler and Corrigan, also speak at the trial and maintain their innocence. And Justice Robert Osborne actually responds to both of these men, stating, "I am satisfied beyond reasonable doubt that it was a killing carried out jointly with Rodney Butler and Trevor Corrigan." And although neither of these men were actually charged, it is widely believed, not only by the judge, but by friends, family, and the general public, that the two of them were also involved in her murder, along with Stephen Bradley. It's just unfortunate that we will never have the evidence that they were there, that they were involved. The car has never been located. No physical evidence was kept, unfortunately. So it looks like they will forever get away with it. And Michelle's sister Karen also made a victim impact statement at the trial, in which she stated, "What hurt my mum the most was the way they left Michelle's body, lying there like a dead dog. That's what struck her in the core. Why they didn't just leave her in a place to be found straight away," end quote. So 30 years after the murder of Michelle Buckingham, Stephen Bradley is found guilty and sentenced to 27 years behind bars with a non-parole period of 21. And he does still remain behind bars today, and the other two men, unfortunately, as I said, with no evidence. And by the way, the murder weapon, the knife, was never found. So they will very likely be, as I said, free forever. But that is today's case. And let me know what you think. I am so glad this case was finally solved. And the fact it was solved basically by a journalist, or at least she was the one that brought it back into the spotlight, back into the public's attention. If she had not done that, I truly believe this case would not have been solved. So well done, Tammy Mills. What an absolute champion. It's truly tragic that her mum never got to see Stephen Bradley be brought to justice. And I do wish all three men that were involved were brought to justice, but at least one person is now being held responsible. But again, let me know your thoughts. Until next time, stay vigilant and stay safe.